Welcome to Talking Business, a podcast produced in Melbourne, Australia. The podcast is available on the Acast site, my own website, the Apple Podcast Store, or wherever you go to get your podcasts. Or you can get it at the Business Acumen website at www.businessacumen.biz. For the most exclusive access to leading economists and business leaders from around the world, subscribe to Talking Business from my website, leongettler.com. I am Leon Gettler. My job is to review and monitor the week's news in business, finance and economics. I bring it all to you every week. This is episode number 5 in our series for 2025, and today's date is Friday, March the 7th. First, I'll be talking to Bob Huber, the Chief Security Officer of Tenable, about why we are struggling to fight the ransomware business and the global cybercrime industry. And I'll be talking to independent economist Saul Eslake about Australia's latest inflation figures, the outlook for any further rate cuts, and what impact Trump's tariffs and inflation-inducing policies will have on central banks, including our own RBA, on interest rates and economic growth. But first, let's talk to Bob Huber.
Bob, why has ransomware become such a flourishing business? And who are the players within the ecosystem? And how does the business model work?
That's a great question, and it's flourished over the last few years. And primarily, I think the word you used is business. It's become a business. The effort to start a business, generally considered a steep curve or a learning curve for any enterprise, mind you, it takes years of effort and expertise. And ransomware over the course of the past few years has built an ecosystem that allows you to not have to be an expert in building out ransomware. There's initial access brokers out there and providers, and I can contract services out. So now I don't have to be an expert myself to get in the ransomware game, so to speak. I can actually contract those areas out where I don't have expertise. And just like any other organization, I pay a fee for their expertise and their services. So as much as I hate to say it, it's lowered the barrier for entry to the market for most entities and organizations. It's just not as difficult to join as it used to be years ago.
So what's the size of the ransomware market?
The ransomware market ballooning every day. And I think what's important to note is, which it became aware in a recently released ransomware report that we produced, is 38% of all attacks are ransomware, which, contrary to popular belief, ransomware makes news quite often. And I don't think people understand that the level of attacks, 38 out of 100 on average, are due to ransomware. So, day in and day out, it does make the media, it does drive a lot of press. We're building programs to reduce risk for the organization, not specific to ransomware. And those best practices, they drive our investments in risk. And on the flip side, the opportunity into the hundreds of millions for ransomware to generate revenue, we're balancing that, right? So people have real financial drivers to implement ransomware or establish ransomware organizations, and we're competing against their investment on our side to try to defend against that. So, my guess is, at least in the near term, the market will continue to grow because the barrier entry becomes so low for most entities wanting to build out ransomware organizations that we will continue to see an uptick. And not only that, as we see economies and organizations that traditionally didn't have a digital footprint transform and adopt digital technologies and IT, the targets just proliferate, which means their targets of opportunity or their market is, in a business sense, I would say their total addressable market, it just grows day in and day out. So I see no reason why we'd see a reduction, even with our investments in defense in the near term, because not everybody's at the same maturity level as far as defending against ransomware. So I think the opportunity for the near term will continue to grow.
So you're saying the ransomware attacks will continue to rise despite the best efforts to curtail them?
Absolutely. There's just so many organizations that, for one reason or another, it's not core to their business, can't make a commensurate investment in defending against ransomware attacks. And it's not a specific investment to ransomware itself. It's foundational cyber hygiene. And if you think about organizations that, whether they're nonprofits, charities, not critical infrastructure, that don't have mandates to make the investment, will they make the investment? And I'm sure they'd like to, but they compete against other business interests and risks. Economic downturn and pandemic, those are risks as well. So they have to balance all those risks and determine where cyber fits into their risks and what they're willing to accept or transfer. And oftentimes, especially for smaller organizations, they just can't make the commensurate investment to defend against those types of attacks.
Well, that would suggest that a lot of organizations, that would include SMEs, need to actually invest in cyber education for executives. Would that be right?
Absolutely. And I think that's a great opportunity for what I would surmise as, minimal investment. You should target the folks who are most likely targets of those operators. So that's people, whether that's executives who have insider knowledge, whether that's people who have privileged access to platforms. And by privileged access, I mean folks who have like administrator accounts or root level accounts, the ability to change or affect a program or an operating system. Biggest bang for the buck, those are the folks that are great targets. Because if you want to achieve an effect at scale across the enterprise, you want to target those who have the largest impact.
Tell me, has the incidence of ransomware grown with the pandemic?
They absolutely have. And I think, it's hard to see if the math quite works out, but given the proliferation of remote work, there's some assumption of controls. As much as I hate to say this, a lot of jobs and work can be done from any location. But in some instances, those controls related to your physical environment of, key card access and badging in and badging out and things such as background checks may not occur as readily in the world we're in, we found ourselves in. And not only that, people are working from home, from remote coffee shops and from libraries and, wherever they can get an internet access point. And we've found now that employees do tend to travel as well. They can still do their work, but some of the controls you would traditionally have in an enterprise that are tied to certain types of access, consistent access through the facility or through a virtual private network, you don't have that when you move to the coffee shop. So there's many assumptions that we take for granted regarding, not only physical controls, and that's not the panacea, that's not going to stop these things, but there's other technical controls that sometimes were developed for a time when we expected folks to be in a facility. And as we've migrated to a remote workforce, in many cases, we've had to loosen those controls to afford people to be able to work from wherever to continue operations for the business.
What this seems to be is, from what you're describing, is an industrial revolution of global cybercrime. So what's the commodification of attacks and techniques used in this?
Yeah, so what's been interesting is they don't have to be novel anymore. There's this idea, and a lot of times, and even in my own teams, there's a lot of focus on what we call zero-day attacks. Zero-day attacks, never before seen. Only a few people know about it. And now what you can see is when they build these kits, and it's literally a kit, if you will, you can pick and choose the pieces. They're already built. So you don't have to develop the initial access or some novel attack to gain access or a foothold to organization. They already exist. You can just click and build these things. It's almost like, in my world, I'd say Legos. My kids like to play with Legos. It's snapping Legos together. So it's taken some of the difficulty away. And like I said, it's made the bar for access much lower.
So where these cyber criminals hang out, who specifically are they? Who would they be?
It's a nefarious bunch, rest assured. Most folks would assume, it's something related to nation state actors. And while we do see some play with nation state actors in the space, it's traditional financial and cyber criminals. It's just the evolution of what they've always done. There was always the idea of some type of extortion attack by somebody who can gain access to your systems for financial gain or financial motivation. And what we've now seen is ideologists can also take that same approach. Nation states can take the same approach. It's just because the ease of entry and access to the market has afforded them that opportunity. So it's the same cast of characters we've always had. It's just the means change and they progress and they've actually improved to where, now we used to talk about an extortion attack where I'm going to limit your access to your resources, your computer that you're on. I'm going to encrypt your files so you don't have availability. That's one step. And now they've taken that a step further and they said, hey, I'm going to encrypt your files. If you pay me, I'll give you access back. And in addition, I'm actually going to disclose sensitive information. So I've actually saved some of your information off and now I'm going to threaten you to disclose the sensitive information. And they've taken even further steps where I'm going to disclose it to your customers, your partners, your suppliers. So, you can see how it's very quickly proliferated from what was, I wouldn't call it an emerging issue. It's been around for years, but something that we at least had our hands around to understand and scope the problem, to now something that we've got to pay attention to all the folks we interact with. And not only that, ensure they have controls in place. So our partners in supply chain as well, because, they're part of our ecosystem and they're also part of our attack surface.
Now, what's interesting is that this is very much a business. So would you have a situation where ransomware groups are bidding against each other to attract affiliates and offering a larger percentage of ransom payments? Do you have that?
Yes, we do. So here's what's interesting about the way these gangs operate now is they don't have to go out and achieve access. They may already have access to a target you or many other actors are interested in. So if that's the case, now it does become a bidding war. And if there's some organization, some emerging topic that I'm interested in, and other actors are also interested in that. So think of something that makes the headline news and people want to target that organization in particular. The initial access brokers may already provide that access, may already have access, and now they can bid up access to the folks who actually want to operate the ransomware. And that's something that, previously it was really assumed to, you want to target an organization, you build your kit, you identify the target, you gain access. Well, now I sell the access, and I sell the access to the highest bidder.
That's quite extraordinary. So you would have different ransomware agents working together as affiliates, as conglomerates.
That's it. Each to their own ends. And everybody, as a traditional business, if I think about contractors I work with, everybody gets a percentage of the cut. So, I would say the person who actually forms the gang, if that's the only piece they do, they take the least cut. The initial access brokers and affiliates, they can take up to 70% of the ransom for the actions they're doing to afford you that access. Now, it really dependent now on what is your motivation. Are you financially motivated? Are you motivated by ideology or some other means? Maybe the financial aspect's not quite as important.
Well, Bob, that's all quite scary stuff, and I'm sure everyone will be fascinated by it. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. I greatly appreciate it.
And now let's talk to independent economist Saul Eslake.
Well, Saul, what's your take on Australia's latest inflation figures and the prospects for further rate cuts?
Well, I think the inflation numbers add a little bit more weight to what we were told by the December monthly and December quarter numbers. That is that headline inflation is comfortably within the Reserve Bank's target range. Indeed, over the 12 months to both December and January, headline inflation was at the midpoint of the Reserve Bank's target range, 2.5%. The Reserve Bank has repeatedly emphasised that they don't pay too much attention to the headline rate because that's influenced by volatile factors and by government measures such as the electricity bill relief that the federal and state governments have been providing over the last couple of years. What they focus on is measures of the so-called underlying inflation rate, and their preferred measure of that, the so-called trimmed mean, which lops off the top 15 and bottom 15% of price changes, that rose by 2.8% over the 12 months to January. That's a tad above the 2.7 over the 12 months to December, but it nonetheless is also within the Reserve Bank's target range. So I think the latest data vindicates the Reserve Bank's decision in mid-February to cut the cash rate for the first time. I don't expect the Reserve Bank to cut the cash rate again at the first meeting of its new monetary policy board on the 30th of March and 1st of April. I think they will want to see the more comprehensive quarterly inflation data, which they won't get until later in April. Therefore, given that I think the March quarter inflation data will show a further decline in Australia's underlying inflation rate, I look for the bank to cut its cash rate again at its meeting that will be held 2 days after the last possible date for the federal election.
So the government can't expect another rate cut?
I don't think they can during the time that's left for the election to be held. Obviously, they can say that they have made, or that sufficient progress has been made in getting inflation down to acceptable levels for the Reserve Bank to have taken its foot slightly off the brake, and that's the best they can hope for. The one concern I have is that if the government thinks that it's not going to get any more rate cuts between now and whenever the election is called, it may well feel free, as it seems to have done, and as the opposition seems to have done, to go on a bit of a spending spree. Because if the Reserve Bank wasn't going to cut interest rates anyway, then they might as well, they think, go and announce lots of spending that they think will be politically popular and will help them at the ballot box, even though the Reserve Bank quietly would probably be dismayed at the prospect of governments adding to demand by spending more and thus complicating the task of beating the last mile of inflation, as central bankers sometimes say.
Indeed, the latest announcements on Medicare, I mean, 8.5 billion up from both sides, they don't show how they're going to rectify the budget deficit at all. And for that matter, Peter Dutton's talking about getting rid of public servants to pay for it.
Well, yeah, and I'm not criticising the notion of spending more on Medicare so that it can achieve its stated objectives. What I'd be critical of, and what I suspect the Reserve Bank, among others, is concerned about, though they'd never say so publicly, is that this spending, like a whole lot of other spending, isn't being funded in some way, either by cuts in government spending elsewhere in the budget or by increases in revenue. Now, the opposition has said they're going to sack 36,000 public servants if they win the next election. That might might sound appealing to some. It might seem like a way of paying for additional spending. But let's remember that at the federal level, spending on the wages and salaries of government employees, including the military, represents about 4% of total government spending. Spending on employees represents about 38% of state government spending, because they actually employ a lot more public servants, police, teachers, nurses, and others than the federal government does. The cuts which Peter Dutton has proposed would, at face value, reduce Commonwealth spending by just 0.3%. And that's without taking account of the fact that, as we saw under the previous coalition government, when public servants are sacked, the jobs that they do are often replaced by more expensive and, in some ways, in some instances, more ethically challenged consultants.
Indeed. But the Reserve Bank said that markets should not expect another rate cut soon, and markets' expectations are unrealistic.
Well, yes, to be precise, the Reserve Bank said that market expectations that there would be 4 and possibly 5 reductions in interest rates, taking the cash rate down to 3.4% by the middle of 2026, were unrealistic. And just to underscore that point, they showed in their staff forecast that if those market projections were to come to pass, in other words, if the Reserve Bank actually did what financial markets are expecting them to do, then inflation would end up higher than they had previously forecast. Now, that's not saying the Reserve Bank thinks inflation will be higher. It's just it thinks inflation will be higher if they cut interest rates by too much. They're not going to. But I think there will be at least one and possibly 2 more interest rate cuts by, say, August of this year, before, on the basis of what we know and expect at the moment, they can think that they've done enough.
But there are also a whole lot of geopolitical factors, such as in the US, Trump, despite his claim that he would bring prices down on day one, we've seen prices go up in his region.
Indeed, and those geopolitical uncertainties, I think, are one factor that limits the scope for more than 2 or 3 interest rate reductions in total, of which we've already had one. Tariffs, by definition, put upward pressure on prices. So does booting out between 1 and 8 million workers, as Trump has pledged to do and has begun to start doing. And so too will adding perhaps 2 percentage points of GDP to a budget deficit that's already running at 6.5% of GDP, as it is in the US. All of that spells higher US inflation. And because the US is a large part of the world economy too, it is also likely to put some upward pressure on inflation around the world, including here in Australia. That upward pressure would be magnified, of course, if other governments responded to US decisions to impose higher taxes on their own consumers by imposing higher taxes on their consumers, which this is circular firing squad stuff, but unfortunately governments often respond in that way. Here in Australia, it would be incredibly stupid of the Australian government to respond to any tariffs the US might choose to impose on exports from Australia to the US by imposing tariffs on things we import from the United States. That would be stupid. But I think Australia showed when China tried to coerce Australia by imposing very high tariffs on a range of exports from Australia to China, we didn't retaliate. We didn't force Australians to pay more for stuff that we import from China. And hopefully the same wise approach would prevail in the event that we are attacked by American tariffs imposed by Donald Trump.
But as you say, that would affect the global economy, and so that would affect other central banks with their interest rates. So we can expect rate rises.
Yes, it would. Yes, it would. I mean, higher tariffs will boost inflation. They will also tend to lower economic growth, and lower economic growth tends to result, all else being equal, in lower interest rates. So it's not completely clear what the impact on interest rates around the world outside the United States will be. One other possibility is, of course, that if China can't export steel, aluminium, and other things, of which it sends large quantities to the United States, then they may seek to sell that stuff in other countries, including here in Australia. Again, the Australian government will have to think carefully whether it accedes to please that will come from producers of things that compete with China imports for higher tariffs to alleviate what they will call dumping. Now, there are some Australian companies who've been very successful in getting the government to force Australian consumers of those products to pay higher higher prices than they would otherwise have to do in order to keep those businesses in Australia here in business. Hopefully, that wouldn't happen on a grand scale if China did decide to divert products that they can't sell to the United States to other markets such as Australia.
Okay, so what impact do you think Trump's tariffs and inflation in the US will have on central banks everywhere around the world, including the RBA?
Well, on balance, I think they're likely to result in higher interest rates than would otherwise be the case. But as I say, there are going to be some offsetting factors, higher inflation to be sure, but also potentially lower growth. And what at the end of the day happens to interest rates will depend on the relative strength of those two opposing forces. And it's difficult to say at the moment what that might be. I mean, we still don't know, for example, whether Australia will be successful in arguing for an exemption from Trump's tariffs, as Malcolm Turnbull and Scott Morrison were able to do. The arguments which they put at that time are as valid today as they were then. It may well be, however, that Donald Trump is even less likely to be influenced by valid arguments than he was back then.
So the impact is basically, it looks like the US is holding up its own roof and no one else's.
Well, yes, and that, I think, is a conclusion that has broader implications. Henry Kissinger used to say sometimes it was dangerous to be an enemy of the United States, but it can be fatal to be a friend of the United States. And, the US under Trump is, again, as it did in its first term, showing, first of all, that it holds its friends in contempt, that being a friend of the United States counts for nothing. And secondly, he's shown that the words of treaty, including the free trade agreement, which we have with the United States, aren't worth the paper they're written on. If Trump thinks that breaking them is part of his perverted vision of making America great again. The US has free trade treaties, in fact, a treaty which he negotiated with Mexico and Canada that is meant to preclude 25% or indeed any tariffs on trade between the US and Canada or Mexico, but he's completely trashed those. I mean, he's trashing parts of the US Constitution that he has, for the second time, taken an oath to defend and uphold. The norms of behaviour for leaders in democratic countries would appear not to apply to Trump, and he knows that the Supreme Court, which he stacked in his first term, has taken the view that if the president does it, it's legal. So the normal defences against the kind of behaviour that Trump is engaging in simply don't apply.
Well, on balance, it looks very, very short term because Trump won't be there forever. And so we'll see what happens.
Well, the thing I'd say to that, Leon, in conclusion, is that Trump might find a way of circumventing the 22nd Amendment that is supposed to limit presidents to 2 terms. But even if he doesn't, the message that we should be drawing of the election results in November last year, which Trump clearly won by the rules that determine the outcomes of US elections, is that it tells us something about the American people, as distinct from Trump himself, that the American people chose him to be their commander-in-chief. Despite knowing all that they know about him, which arguably they didn't in 2016, that tells us that the American people are very different from the American people that we have relied on since John Curtin famously turned to them in 1941. And the likelihood is that Trump will be followed by Vance or someone like him for 4 and maybe 8 years. And in some ways, Vance could be worse than Trump. And some of the other people that are alternatives to Vance as a Republican nominee in 2028 could be worse than Trump. So, we have to come to terms with the fact that the America of today is a very different country from the America of the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s.
Well, Saul, that's all quite sobering. And thank you so much again for your time.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me, Leon.
So what's happening in the news? Well, global investors have reacted with horror to the introduction of US President Donald Trump's 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada and 10% on China, and what looks like a trade war, with Beijing declaring it would impose a 10 to 15% levy on US agricultural goods, including soybeans, beef, corn and wheat, from March the 10th, and Canada saying it would immediately retaliate with a 25% tariff on $30 billion of US imports, and vowed similar action against a further $125 billion of US goods 21 days later. So what's happening in stock markets? Well, stocks in Europe and Asia have fallen, with car makers including Volkswagen, BMW and Daimler Truck, who have complex cross-border supply chains, being particularly hard hit. In London, the FTSE 100 index of the UK's biggest publicly listed companies ended the day down 1.2%. The falls in Europe and Asia follow a late sell-off on Wall Street, with the S&P 500 and Nasdaq indices having their worst session of the year. The protracted fight could dent global growth and accelerate inflation. Mike Hayfell, the Chief Investment Officer at UBS Global Wealth Management, told Bloomberg Television. Investors are now fretting about inflation and US growth. Some are concerned the US could fall into recession. These factors, combined with the stock market, could force the White House into a rethink on tariffs. But who knows? Trump is particularly unpredictable, particularly with US Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick shrugging off concerns about potential pain for US households. There may well be short-term price movements, but in the long term, it's going to be completely different. This is going to be the greatest America, he told CNBC. And Musk's team Musketeers, aged between 19 and 24, who are barely out and some still in college, are making huge mistakes in cutting US government infrastructure. They claim credit for cancelling procurement agreements that had been completed years earlier on their website. While George W. Bush was president, the US Coast Guard signed a contract to get administrative help from a company in Northern Virginia. It paid $144,000, and the contract was completed by June 30th, 2005. 20 years passed, presidents came and went. Last week, Elon Musk's restructuring team, called the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, said it just cancelled the long-dead Coast Guard contract, and in doing so, saved US taxpayers $53.7 million. They didn't save anything. The contract was long finished. These are not savings, said Lisa Shearmunt, whose firm, the Pulso GovCon, tracks federal spending. The money's been spent, period, point blank. These mistakes do not mean DOGE has not made cuts to the federal government. It has, deeply, by pushing widespread layoffs of employees and cancellation of active contracts, and by helping instigate the demise of the US Agency for International Development. But the repeated errors have raised questions about the quality and veracity of the information that the Musk team is putting out, including whether it's been misled by other departments. The mistakes also seem to call into question the team members' competence, whether they understand the government well enough to cut it while avoiding catastrophe. It's obvious that they don't understand, said Eric Franklin, the chief executive of the firm Erimax, who advises the government on contract procedures. His own firm was the subject of one of the errors on DOGE's wall of receipts. Mr. Musk's group claimed it had saved $14 million by cancelling one of the contracts, which had ended in 2021. It's really akin to a bull in a china shop, Mr. Franklin said, and what you end up, it's just a big mess. Then again, it makes sense. What was anyone doing between the ages of 19 and 24? And the reality is, Europe faces a huge bill to defend Ukraine. The question is whether Europe, facing high debt loads, chronically low growth and looming tariffs imposed by Trump, can afford more military spending. Ending the Russia-Ukraine war carries a high cost. This coincides with President Trump ordering a pause to all military aid to Ukraine, including weapons already in transit, sharply escalating pressure on Kiev to agree to peace negotiations with Russia. Prime Minister Keir Starmer of Britain rolled out a 4-point plan over the weekend at a gathering of European leaders and Ukraine leader Mrs. Zelensky. Mr. Starmer's proposal includes an Anglo-French coalition that willing to defend any eventual deal for Ukraine, which could mean boots on the ground and planes in the air. Britain also lent £2.6 billion, that's $5.3 billion Aussie, to Ukraine to help bolster its military forces. Even before the summit of EU leaders following Zelensky's disastrous meeting with Trump in the Oval Office, credit agency warned about Europe's finances. For example, Fitch Ratings has warned that increasing military spending of NATO members to 3% of their GDP, which is still short of the 5% that Mr. Trump wants, could force European governments to make unpopular spending cuts that weaken social safety nets. The stakes are high. Failure to help Ukraine could eventually push European nations into accepting a deal that favours President Vladimir Putin of Russia. That could test the bloc's cohesion, analysts say, but might be welcomed by those interested in seeing a divided Europe. Trump, Putin and possibly Elon Musk all seem to dislike the European Union. Holger Schmeidig, an economist at the German bank Berenberg wrote in a research note on Monday. They would prefer to deal one by one with a panoply of minnows and middling countries than with a union that represents the second biggest market in the world. Needless to say, shares in Europe's defence giants, including the British defence contractor BAE Systems, the German arms manufacturer Rheinmetall, and the Italian aerospace and defence specialist Leonardo, have hit record highs. And there are two chances of Australia getting exemption from Trump's tariffs: Buckley's and none. That's a message from Donald Trump's trade advisor Peter Navarro, who has accused Australia of dumping subsidised below-cost aluminium into the United States. That's right, he's drawing comparisons to the behaviour of Russia and China amid rising concerns the Albanese government will fail to secure an exemption from tariffs. Just days after Treasurer Jim Chalmers visited Washington to plead the government's case for a carve-out from 25% tariffs on steel and aluminium, the staunch protectionist, whose goal is to bolster American manufacturing, said ending country-specific exemptions sends a clear message. And billionaire heiress Heloise Pratt has accused ex-husband Alex Weislitz of taking more than $21 million in loans to buy a luxury Melbourne apartment and also used funds to purchase property for his fiancée and back companies connected to her music career. Ms. Pratt has alleged Mr. Weislitz authorised transfers of $20 million to buy an apartment in the St. Moritz project built by prominent rich lister Tim Gurner from the shared company Tigger Trading and subsidiaries without her approval and knowledge, even though she's a director, latest court documents in an ongoing legal stoush reveal. Mr. Weislitz is also accused of spending about $1.23 million from the same company on 2 units in the exclusive suburb of Toorak, occupied rent-free by his now fiancée, Rebecca Bebahani, and a sister, Venus. Ms. Pratt alleged Mr. Weislitz loaned the money to a company called Bahani Music Productions and RB Norms, which trades as Flytime Promotions, likely in the support of Ms. Bahani's pop music career. The Supreme Court documents are the latest in a messy legal fight playing out in public after negotiations about the ownership of their jointly owned $1.3 billion Thorney Investments business broke down last year. Whilst Alexander Weislitz has either alone or with an advisor exercised de facto control over the Halix Family Trust, Alexander Weislitz has acted dishonestly for his own benefit and engaged in criminality, an updated statement of claim alleged. Of course, the Pratt heiress knows about messy family relationships. The love child of a billionaire father, Richard Pratt, has lodged a multi-billion-dollar inheritance claim alleging Anthony Pratt and his siblings Heloise and Fiona Gaminda were aware of their half-sister's position in the family and regularly saw their father's bonds of love and affection for her. And Carolyn Heinemann, who has accused WiseTech Global billionaire executive chairman Richard White of providing her with a visa and financial support in return for sex, has been assisted by lawyers at Anti-Slavery Australia as she secures a special arrangement needed to fight her case. Heidemann has alleged in the federal court that White, who she had worked for, made it clear that financial assistance was contingent upon her engaging in a personal and sexual relationship with him. That's akin to sex slavery. And Australia's property market emerged from a shallow downturn in February as the first rate cut in over 4 years lifted by sentiment, although the still high borrowing costs and elevated prices are clouding the outlook. Figures from property consultant CoreLogic showed prices across the nation rose 0.3% in February from January, ending 3 months of declines or no growth. That helped national prices settle just 0.1% lower from their peak hit in October. Melbourne and Hobart, where prices fell over the past year, led the gains, with both rising 0.4% in a month. Tim Lawless, CoreLogic's research director, said the bounce in prices had more to do with an uptick in sentiment than any immediate improvement in borrowing capacity, as rates were only lowered by a quarter point, which doesn't deliver that much money to anyone. The rate cutting cycle is very fresh and is likely to be drawn out. Interest rate settings are likely to remain in restrictive territory for some time yet, said Lawless. Until home loan serviceability improves more substantially, it's hard to see housing markets moving into a material growth trend. The Reserve Bank of Australia has cautioned that any further easing will be gradual, with market pricing suggesting just 2 more cuts to 3.6% by the end of the year. And a coalition government would force public servants to work from the office 5 days per week. Opposition finance spokeswoman Jane Hume said this will put an end to generous work from home arrangements that she claims have become unsustainable and unproductive. After surging during the pandemic, Work-for-home arrangements have been in retreat across the globe as companies announce office attendance mandates under the guise of promoting collaboration and innovation. One of US President Donald Trump's first actions after taking office in January was to order all federal government departments to terminate remote work arrangements as soon as possible. And the AFL has admitted its integrity system for online gambling is seriously deficient and struggles to identify whether players, coaches and staff are using inside information to manipulate betting markets in breach of their contracts. Leaked documents reveal executives have expressed alarm about an unprecedented increase in integrity risks posed by the wagering industry, which has exploded in popularity since the pandemic, with more than 80 bookmakers now taking bets on its games. The documents reveal the AFL lacks visibility across a broad cross-section of betting turnover and only sees a tip of the iceberg. It has also raised concern about several bottlenecks and blind spots that have prevented it from quickly detecting if players, coaches and staff are betting on games or sharing sensitive information. These concerns, which have not been spoken about publicly, have been used by the AFL to justify a campaign to seize an even bigger share of the money Australians gamble on its games. This is despite sustained criticism for its close association with the wagering sector and its gambling advertising being viewed by impressionable children. And speaking of the AFL, lawyers say former star footballer Nicky Winmar could spearhead a class action against the AFL, which is being sued by Indigenous players who suffered racist abuse on the field. Winmar, now 59, was at the centre of one of the league's most iconic moments 3 decades ago, when he was photographed defiantly lifting his jumper and pointing to his skin while being racially abused by Collingwood fans at Victoria Park. Michael Margalit, the lawyer running the class action on behalf of the players, told reporters outside the Supreme Court of Victoria that Winmar was a group member of the suit and was willing to become a co-plaintiff in the case. He really stands to fight to eradicate racial vilification in the game, Mr. Margalit said. Mr. Winmar suffered prolonged racial vilification in the workplace, and this certainly culminated in that famous moment when he was photographed in 1993. The lawsuit was originally brought by Phil and James Cracker and includes an unspecified number of Indigenous players. The players alleged they suffered injury, loss and damage after the AFL failed to protect them from racial abuse from spectators, opposition players and coaches. Any proposed bid for him to become a co-lead plaintiff in the case would also be subject to court approval. Mark Costello, KC, representing the AFL, told the court his client was seeking for the class action to be dismissed and that there were fundamental difficulties with the case theory. Mr. Costello said the matter had been going for 18 months and expressed frustration that the plaintiffs had not finalised the statement of claim. On Monday, Justice Andrew Keogh granted the plaintiffs a further 2 months to build their case. And that's it for this week. And next week I'll be talking to Trilogy Hotels CEO Scott Boyce to discuss the adoption of independent hotel management models in Australia, a relatively new and unfamiliar model in Australia, despite being the preferred and most predominant model in both the US and Europe. And I'll be talking to AMP Chief Economist Shane Oliver about the latest profit reporting season. For the most exclusive access to leading economists and business leaders from around the world, subscribe to Talking Business from my website leongettler.com. If you like Talking Business, please leave us a review with Apple Podcasts. Thank you in advance. In the meantime, you can find me on Facebook, Twitter, or X as it's now known, Instagram, LinkedIn and YouTube. If you want to contact me, email me at leon@leongettler.com. I answer all emails. Also in my spare time, I have a copywriting business. If anyone needs newsletters, blogs, articles or advertorial, email me. Looking forward to next week's episode of Talking Business.